At my sister Ebony's wedding, I was handed a cheap paper badge that read, "Limited Access Guest." My mother leaned in and whispered that this meant no dinner plate for me. She actually told me to go eat a sandwich in my car so I would not embarrass the family. I looked at her, then walked straight to the gift table. I retrieved the envelope containing my $100,000 check and said, "I think you won't need this anymore." My sister ran after me screaming, and my parents shouted for me to come back, but I just kept walking. My name is Nia, and I am 29 years old. As I sit here in my penthouse living room, swirling a glass of vintage red wine, my phone is still blowing up with notifications. My entire family is calling me a villain. But looking at the peace and quiet of my own home, I have never felt more like a hero. To understand why I left my sister at the altar without her funding, you have to understand the dynamic of the Jenkins family. For years, I was the bank account, and my sister Ebony was the princess. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who only loved you for what you could provide. It all started yesterday afternoon at the Vineyard Estate. The venue was breathtaking. Imported white orchids draped over every archway, and a fleet of rented white limousines lined the driveway. It smelled like old money, which is ironic because my parents are currently drowning in debt. I pulled up in my brand new Porsche Taycan, the electric hum of the engine turning heads as I approached the valet stand. I felt good. I looked good. I was wearing a silk designer dress that cost more than Ebony's DJ. I thought, for once, I might just be treated like a guest instead of a utility. But before I could even open my door, my father, Marcus, came rushing over. He wasn't smiling. He looked stressed, sweating through his rented tuxedo. He tapped on my window aggressively. I rolled it down, expecting a hello or perhaps a compliment. Instead, he hissed at me. "Nia, you cannot park here. This lot is reserved for the groom's family and the VIP guests." I looked around the paved lot. There were empty spots everywhere. I asked him where he wanted me to go. He pointed a thumb over his shoulder toward a muddy, unpaved patch of grass behind the catering trucks where the portable toilets were stationed. "Park back there," he said. "We need this front row open for Connor's parents. They are arriving in a Rolls Royce, and I do not want your car clashing with the aesthetic." I gripped the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles turned white. My car is a $150,000 vehicle, a symbol of the success I built from nothing, and he was worried it would clash with his fantasy? He didn't see his daughter. He saw a prop that was out of place. But I didn't argue. I just nodded, shifted gears, and drove my pristine Porsche into the mud. That should have been my first sign to turn around and leave, but I had no idea that the disrespect was only just beginning. I wiped the mud from my $600 heels and composed myself before walking toward the grand entrance of the vineyard. The transition was jarring. One minute I was standing in a puddle, and the next I was stepping onto a red carpet flanked by security guards in black suits. The air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh money. I watched as my cousins and distant relatives were greeted with warm smiles and glasses of chilled champagne. They were being handed their name tags, which were actually beautiful, laser-engraved slate coasters that served as keepsakes. It was a nice touch. It was elegant. It was exactly the kind of detail I would have designed, and I knew exactly whose credit score had likely been leveraged to pay for it. When I reached the front of the line, the warmth instantly evaporated. Manning the check-in table was Chloe, my sister Ebony's maid of honor and best friend since high school. Chloe has never liked me, mostly because I refused to hire her unqualified brother at my interior design firm 3 years ago. She looked up at me, her eyes scanning my silk dress with a mixture of jealousy and disdain. I smiled and gave her my name. I expected her to reach for one of the slate coasters on the table. Instead, she reached into a cardboard box hidden underneath the tablecloth. She pulled out a plastic sandwich bag and retrieved a badge that looked like it belonged to a kindergarten field trip. It was a bright, neon yellow piece of laminated paper attached to a cheap, scratchy blue nylon string. It stood out aggressively against the muted, tasteful colors of the wedding theme. She handed it to me with a smirk that told me she had been waiting for this moment all day. I took the badge and looked at the text. In bold, black, Comic Sans font, it read, "Limited Access Guest." I felt a knot form in my stomach. I asked her if this was some kind of joke. I asked where my slate coaster was. Chloe leaned forward, resting her elbows on the white tablecloth, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. She told me that there was no mistake. She said that my mother, Denise, had given strict instructions regarding the guest list tiers. She explained that the yellow badge meant I was restricted to Zone B. She told me I was not permitted inside the main ballroom or the VIP cocktail lounge where the groom's family and the important guests were currently gathering. I looked past her shoulder at the large seating chart displayed on an easel. I scanned the names. I saw distant uncles, neighbors, and even my parents' pastor listed at tables 1 through 10 in the main hall. I asked her where Zone B was. Chloe pointed a manicured finger toward a side door that led to a service corridor. She said it was an overflow area because the main hall was at capacity. I stood there for a moment, holding that neon yellow piece of plastic. A waiter walked by with a tray of crab cakes, and when he saw the yellow badge in my hand, he actually steered around me, offering food only to the guests with the slate coasters. It was a system designed to make me feel small. It was a calculated humiliation to remind me of my place in the hierarchy. My mother wanted to make sure that even if I showed up looking like $1 million, everyone would know I was considered second class. I looked at Chloe, who was practically beaming with satisfaction. I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene. I simply clasped the scratchy nylon string around my neck, letting the ugly yellow badge rest against my designer dress. If they wanted to treat me like a liability, I was about to show them just how expensive a liability could be. I walked toward the service corridor, clutching my purse tight. Inside that purse was the check that was supposed to save them from financial ruin. I wondered how much longer they could keep up this charade of wealth when the bank started calling on Monday. I tightened my grip on my clutch and marched toward the double mahogany doors of the main ballroom. Even from the hallway, I could hear the delicate strains of a live string quartet playing classical music. Through the glass panels, I saw a world of absolute opulence. There were crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hanging from the ceiling, and the centerpieces were towering arrangements of white roses and hydrangeas that probably cost more than my first car. In the center of the room, standing by a massive ice sculpture, were my parents. My father, Marcus, was holding a glass of scotch, laughing loudly at something Connor's father said. My mother, Denise, was clutching the arm of Connor's mother, Patricia, looking desperate to please. They looked the part of the wealthy, established family they pretended to be. My mother spotted me through the glass. For a split second, our eyes locked. I expected her to wave me in, or at least look guilty. Instead, she adjusted her fascinator hat and deliberately turned her back to me, blocking me from view as if I were a stain on the window that she could simply ignore. I reached for the door handle, but a large hand covered in a black glove stopped me. A security guard, who looked more like a bouncer for a nightclub than wedding staff, stepped into my path. He didn't look me in the face. He looked directly at the humiliating yellow badge hanging around my neck. "I am sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice flat and practiced. "This entrance is for slate access guests only. Zone B is down the hall, through the service exit, and to the left." I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. I told him I was the sister of the bride. I told him I paid for half of this reception. He didn't budge. He just pointed a thick finger toward a narrow hallway where the catering staff were hauling bags of trash. I had no choice. I turned away from the music and the air conditioning and walked down the service corridor. The smell of expensive perfume was quickly replaced by the scent of old grease and garbage. When I pushed open the heavy metal exit door, the humidity hit me like a physical blow. Zone B was not a room. It was a white canvas tent erected on a patch of dying grass, strategically placed behind the catering trucks so it wouldn't be visible from the main venue. It was dangerously close to a row of portable toilets that were already starting to smell in the afternoon heat. Inside, there were no chandeliers. There were plastic folding chairs and bare tables. Sit at one of the wobbly tables was my Aunt Bernice, the family black sheep who had been ostracized years ago for refusing to lend my father money for one of his failed pyramid schemes. Next to her sat Mrs. Higgins, the elderly nanny who had practically raised Ebony and me while our parents were out social climbing. Mrs. Higgins looked frail, wearing her Sunday best, clutching a purse that had seen better days. I walked over and sat down. Aunt Bernice looked at my yellow badge and let out a dry, humorless laugh. She asked if I had been put in the doghouse too. I nodded, feeling a mix of rage and shame. Then Mrs. Higgins reached out and patted my hand. Her hand was shaking. She whispered that she didn't mind sitting outside. She said she just wanted to see Ebony in her white dress, even from a distance. Then she lowered her voice and admitted that she had driven 2 hours to get here because my father had promised to finally pay her the 6 months of back wages he owed her from 5 years ago. She said he told her there would be an envelope for her at the table. I looked at the empty plastic table. There were no envelopes. There was no food. There was just the hum of the generator and the sound of my family partying inside on my dime. That was the moment my sadness turned into cold, hard resolve. They weren't just humiliating me. They were exploiting the most vulnerable people in our lives. I looked at the tent flap leading back to the main building. I decided I wasn't going to sit in the heat while they drank champagne. I was going to get what belonged to me. By 7 o'clock, the smell coming from the main ballroom was agonizing. It wasn't just food. It was the scent of status. I could smell seared Wagyu beef, garlic butter lobster tails, and truffle oil. My stomach rumbled loudly, echoing in the silence of the tent. Mrs. Higgins, who I knew was diabetic and needed to eat, looked faint. I watched through the gap in the tent flap as a parade of waiters marched out of the kitchen. They were carrying silver trays covered with metal domes, moving with military precision toward the VIP tables inside. I stood up and intercepted a waiter who was cutting through our tent to get to the service station. I asked him, politely, when the service for Zone B would begin. He stopped and looked down at his clipboard, then glanced at my yellow badge. He told me bluntly that there was no meal service for Zone B. He said we were allotted water and dinner rolls, but the rolls had already run out during the cocktail hour. He didn't even apologize. He just walked away, leaving me standing there while my aunt let out a disgusted sigh. That was when the tent flap whipped open again. It wasn't a waiter this time. It was my mother, Denise. She looked frantic, her face caked in a layer of powder so thick it looked like it might crack if she smiled too hard. She wasn't coming to check on us. She was coming to do damage control. She rushed over to me, grabbing my arm with a grip that was surprisingly painful. She hissed at me to sit down and stop harassing the staff. I pulled my arm away and asked her if she was serious. I asked her how she could let her own sister and the woman who raised her children sit here starving while she feasted on lobster. Denise rolled her eyes, as if my hunger was a personal inconvenience to her. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of expensive champagne, and whispered the words that finally broke whatever bond we had left. She told me that the yellow badge meant no plate. She explained that the budget had exploded because the groom's family insisted on the Wagyu upgrade, so they had to make cuts where it wouldn't be noticed. She said that since I was family, I should understand that sacrifices had to be made to impress the in-laws. Then came the final insult. She looked me up and down and told me that I could stand to skip a meal anyway. She suggested that if I was really that hungry, I should go out to my car and eat a sandwich, or drive to a fast food place down the road. Her eyes darted nervously toward the main entrance. She told me to be discreet if I left. She said she didn't want Connor's parents to see me walking out to the parking lot because it would look trashy. She actually told me to wait until the speeches started so I could slip out unseen. She patted my cheek, a gesture that felt more like a slap, and told me to be a good big sister for once and not ruin Ebony's moment with my selfishness. Then she turned on her heel and rustled back into the air-conditioned ballroom, leaving me in the heat with nothing but my rage. I looked at Mrs. Higgins, who was trembling slightly from low blood sugar. I realized then that they didn't just see me as a limited guest. They didn't see me as human. I reached for my purse. I wasn't going to the car. I was going to the gift table. I watched the tent flap swing shut behind my mother, leaving me in the stifling heat. A younger version of myself would have cried. I would have sat in that plastic chair, choked down the dry dinner roll, and driven home feeling like I was the problem. But I wasn't that little girl anymore. I was a business owner who spotted bad investments for a living, and as I sat there, the events of last Tuesday replayed in my mind with crystal clarity. I remembered sitting at my parents' kitchen table. My father, a man too proud to ever ask for directions, had his head in his hands, weeping. My mother was clutching her chest, giving the performance of a lifetime. They told me Ebony had finally changed. They said she wanted to open a sustainable fashion boutique. They said she had a business plan. They pleaded with me to provide the seed capital because the banks wouldn't touch her. They said, "Nia, please, this is her chance to be independent like you. This is her fresh start." I wrote that check for $100,000 because I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that my sister was finally growing up. But as I looked through the gap in the canvas tent, staring at the main ballroom, the lie unraveled before my eyes. I did the math in my head. The imported orchids, the live string quartet, the rental fee for this vineyard, the custom lighting rig. This wasn't a wedding on a budget. This was a 6-figure coronation ceremony. They hadn't used my money for a business. They had used it to fund this circus, banking on the fact that I would be too polite to ask questions. They took my hard-earned money to throw a party where I wasn't even allowed to eat. Then I saw her. Ebony was standing near the head table. She wasn't glowing with the humility of a blushing bride. She was holding a bottle of Dom Perignon, the vintage kind that costs $300 a bottle. She wasn't looking at her husband. She was looking directly at the service tent. She raised the bottle in a mock toast, pointed a manicured finger right at where I was sitting, and said something to her bridesmaids. They all threw their heads back and laughed. That was the moment the sadness evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She wasn't just ungrateful. She was laughing at the bank she had just robbed. She was toasting to my stupidity. Something inside me snapped, not with a bang, but with the quiet, terrifying click of a lock turning. I stood up. The legs of the cheap plastic chair scraped loudly against the concrete floor. Mrs. Higgins looked up at me, her eyes wide with worry. She asked if I was going to the car to get a sandwich like my mother suggested. I smoothed down the front of my silk dress and picked up my clutch. I looked at the old woman and shook my head. I told her I wasn't going to the car. I told her I was going to get a refund. I walked out of the tent, past the overflowing trash cans, and marched straight back toward the service entrance. The security guard from earlier saw me coming. He stepped forward to block my path again, opening his mouth to recite the rules about Zone B. I didn't slow down. I walked right past him with such force and authority that he actually stepped back, confused by the shift in my energy. I wasn't a limited guest anymore. I was the CEO of this entire event, and I was coming to shut it down. The double doors swung open with a heavy thud. The blast of air conditioning felt like a different world compared to the stifling heat of the tent. I stepped onto the marble floor of the main ballroom. I didn't sneak in. I walked down the center aisle with my chin held high. The chatter died down instantly. The string quartet trailed off into an awkward silence. The only sound in the cavernous room was the rhythmic clicking of my heels. Click, click, click. I saw my mother freeze mid-bite. I saw Ebony's smile vanish. They looked at me with a mixture of confusion and fear. They were waiting for me to make a scene, to scream, to cry. But I didn't even look at them. My eyes were locked on a single target, the gift table. It was set up on a raised platform next to the stage, draped in silver velvet and piled high with expensive appliances and a mountain of envelopes. I ascended the small staircase to the platform. I could feel 500 pairs of eyes burning into my back. I reached the table and began sifting through the pile. I found it immediately. It was a thick maroon envelope with my name, Nia, written in calligraphy on the front. I picked it up. My father, Marcus, stood up from the head table, his face turning a deep shade of purple. He opened his mouth to shout something, but I was faster. I didn't just pocket the envelope. I tore it open. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the silent hall. I pulled out the cashier's check. The blue security ink shimmered under the chandeliers. I held it up so the light caught the zeros. $100,000. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The guests at the front tables could clearly see the amount. Next to the gift table stood the DJ, looking terrified. I reached over and gently took the microphone from his hand. The feedback squealed for a second, making everyone wince. I looked directly at my mother, who was now clutching her pearls, her face pale beneath her makeup. My voice remained calm, steady, and terrifyingly polite. "Mom, you were absolutely right earlier," I said, my voice booming through the speakers. "You told me the family budget was extremely tight. You said sacrifices had to be made, which is why I was seated by the toilets without a meal. I completely understand." I waved the check in the air. "So, to help alleviate the financial pressure, I have decided to rescind this donation. I think you won't be needing this $100,000 sponsorship anymore." I let the words hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. I didn't wait for a response. I dropped the microphone onto the table. It landed with a loud thud that sounded like a gavel closing a court case. The moment the microphone hit the table, the room exploded into chaos. It started with a collective gasp, followed immediately by the frantic murmuring of 300 guests. I tucked the check safely into my clutch and looked down at the head table. The facade of the perfect, wealthy family had shattered instantly. Connor, my new brother-in-law, looked like he had been slapped. He turned to Ebony, his face pale and confused. He asked her loudly enough for the front tables to hear, asking what money I was talking about. He said she told him the vineyard was a gift from her parents' investment dividends. Ebony didn't answer him. She didn't even look at him. She let out a scream that was less like a bride and more like a wounded animal. She hiked up her massive layered tulle skirt and scrambled off the dais, abandoning all grace. "Nia, you stop right there!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Do not walk out of here with my money!" My father, Marcus, recovered from his shock faster than I expected. He wasn't running to comfort his daughter. He was running for the check. He lunged across the gift table, knocking over a crystal vase that shattered loudly on the floor. He roared that I was a thief and demanded security to stop me. But the security guards were frozen. They were confused, looking back and forth between the composed woman in the silk dress walking calmly toward the exit and the hysterical family members knocking over furniture. I didn't run. Running is for people who are guilty. I walked with purpose. I could hear heavy footsteps thundering behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw Ebony tripping over her long train, stumbling into a waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes. The crash of breaking glass mixed with her sobbing was the soundtrack to my exit. Mrs. Patricia, Connor's mother, was standing up, clutching a napkin to her mouth, looking at my parents with absolute horror. The illusion was gone. She wasn't looking at a wealthy family anymore. She was looking at a train wreck. I pushed through the heavy double doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The valet saw me coming and rushed to open the door of my Porsche, but I waved him off. I jumped into the driver's seat and hit the ignition button. The engine roared to life, a deep, powerful growl that drowned out the shouting coming from the venue entrance. Just as I shifted into gear, the doors burst open. My father, mother, and Ebony stumbled out onto the pavement. Ebony was barefoot now, her expensive makeup streaming down her face in black streaks. My father was red-faced, veins bulging in his neck, pointing a shaking finger at the car. He screamed that if I left, I was dead to this family. I rolled down the window just an inch, looking at them one last time. I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt lighter than I had in 20 years. I told them to enjoy the cake. Then I slammed on the gas. Because my father had forced me to park in the unpaved mudlot, my rear tires spun aggressively in the dirt before gripping the asphalt. A massive rooster tail of brown mud sprayed backward, splattering across the front of my father's tuxedo and the hem of Ebony's white dress. I watched in the rearview mirror as they stood there, covered in dirt and defeat, shrinking into the distance as I sped toward the highway. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. The drive home was a blur of adrenaline and satisfaction. But the moment I stepped into the sanctuary of my penthouse, the reality of what I had done began to sink in. I kicked off my muddy heels and walked straight to the wine cellar. I pulled out a bottle of vintage Cabernet, the kind I had been saving for a special occasion. I figured escaping a toxic cult was special enough. But as I poured the dark red liquid into a crystal glass, the silence of my apartment was shattered by the aggressive buzzing of my phone on the marble kitchen island. It wasn't ringing. It was vibrating continuously, a relentless, angry hum that sounded like a swarm of hornets. I walked over and looked down at the screen. I had 47 new text messages and 12 missed calls. The family group chat, which I had muted years ago, was exploding. I unlocked the screen and watched the messages roll in. They weren't from my parents or Ebony. They were from the flying monkeys. That is what we call the relatives who are manipulated by the narcissist to do their dirty work. There was a message from my Auntie Sarah, a woman who hasn't called me on my birthday in a decade. It read, "Nia, how could you be so selfish? You ruined your sister's special day over a seating chart. You need to turn that car around and apologize immediately." I scrolled down. There was one from my cousin Marcus Jr. It said, "You are just jealous because Ebony found a husband and you are still alone. You always have to make everything about you." I took a long sip of wine, letting the rich flavor settle my nerves. It was fascinating, really. In the 30 minutes it took me to drive home, my mother and sister had already spun a narrative. They hadn't told the family that they sat me next to the portable toilets. They hadn't told anyone that they denied me food while I footed the bill. No, the story they were selling was that I was a bitter, jealous spinster who threw a tantrum and stole the honeymoon money. I put the phone face down on the counter. I didn't block them, not yet. I wanted to keep the receipts. Because what none of these people understood was that the $100,000 wasn't a wedding gift. It was a ransom payment. It was the price I had agreed to pay to keep my sister out of prison. And by humiliating me today, they had just violated the terms of our agreement. To understand why I kept that check, you first have to understand where the money came from. I didn't inherit wealth like Connor's family, and I certainly didn't scam people like my father. I built a luxury interior design firm from the ground up. By the time I was 27, I was designing penthouses for athletes and tech CEOs. I was the one success story in the Jenkins family, the proof that we could make it out of the struggle. But success makes you a target, especially when you are surrounded by people who feel entitled to your harvest without doing any of the planting. 2 years ago, I walked into a bank in downtown Chicago feeling invincible. I had found the perfect location for my first commercial showroom, a beautiful brick loft in the West Loop. I had the business plan, the cash flow, and a 20% down payment sitting in my savings account. I sat across from the loan officer, a nice man named Mr. Henderson, ready to sign the paperwork for a commercial mortgage. I had checked my credit score 6 months prior, and it was impeccable. I expected a handshake and a congratulations. Instead, Mr. Henderson went quiet. The clicking of his keyboard stopped, and a confused frown settled between his eyebrows. He turned the monitor away from me and cleared his throat. He asked me if I was aware of the outstanding derogatory marks on my file. I laughed, thinking he was joking. I told him I had 0 debt. He didn't laugh back. He turned the screen around so I could see the credit report. My stomach dropped to the floor. The screen was a sea of red. There were 5 credit cards listed that I had never applied for. An American Express Platinum, a Chase Sapphire, 2 store cards from high-end department stores, and a Discover card. All of them were maxed out. All of them were currently in collections for non-payment. The total debt was staggering, $82,000. I felt the blood drain from my face. I told him this was impossible. I told him I was a victim of identity theft and that we needed to call the police immediately. Mr. Henderson looked at me with pity. He pointed to the bottom of the report, where the billing address for all 5 cards was listed. I expected to see a random address or a P.O. box used by a professional scammer. Instead, I saw the address I knew better than my own, 42 Oak Creek Drive. my parents' house. The house where my sister Ebony still lived rent-free because she claimed she was too anxious to work a 9-to-5 job. I sat there in that leather chair, unable to breathe. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a hacker. It was my baby sister. While I was working 80-hour weeks to build my reputation, Ebony had stolen my Social Security number from my old bedroom drawer. She hadn't used the money for emergencies or medical bills. I scanned the transaction history Mr. Henderson printed out for me. It was sickening. Designer handbags, VIP concert tickets, a week-long trip to Cabo San Lucas that she told us was a gift from a rich boyfriend, and thousands of dollars spent at nightclubs. She had been living the life of a millionaire using my credit, systematically destroying my future one swipe at a time. I walked out of that bank without my loan, but with a folder full of evidence that would tear my family apart. I spent the next 48 hours doing something no sister should ever have to do. I was building a criminal case against my own flesh and blood. Because I had filed a preliminary fraud report, I was able to work with the loss prevention departments of the stores where the cards were used. The evidence they sent over was high definition and undeniable. It wasn't a grainy shadow of a stranger in a hoodie. It was crystal clear footage of Ebony standing at the counter of the Chanel boutique on Michigan Avenue. She was wearing a trench coat I had bought her for Christmas, laughing with the sales associate as she swiped a card that bore my name to pay for a $5,000 classic flat bag. I drove to my parents' house on a Sunday evening. I knew everyone would be there for the weekly family dinner that I was usually excluded from. I walked into the living room without knocking. My mother, Denise, was setting the table. My father was watching football. Ebony was sitting on the sofa, scrolling through Instagram on a new iPhone that I now realized I had unwittingly paid for. When they saw me, the room went silent. I didn't say a word. I simply opened my leather portfolio and fanned the photographs out on the coffee table like a winning hand of poker. There were screenshots of the surveillance footage, copies of the credit card receipts with her forged signature which looked nothing like mine, and a spreadsheet totaling the $82,000 in theft. Ebony looked at the photos and turned a ghostly shade of pale. She dropped her phone on the carpet. I expected my parents to explode. I expected my father to yell. I expected my mother to grab Ebony by the ear. Instead, the room remained terrifyingly quiet. My mother picked up a photo of Ebony buying Gucci loafers. She studied it for a moment, then looked up at me with eyes cold enough to freeze hell. She didn't look angry at the thief. She looked disappointed in the victim. She tossed the photo back onto the table and let out a sigh of annoyance. "Nia, you are being incredibly dramatic," my mother said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Your sister didn't steal anything. She borrowed your credit line to build her image. She is trying to attract a high-value partner, and she needs to look the part. You know how the world works. You have excellent credit and plenty of money. Why are you counting pennies when your sister is trying to secure a future for this family?" I stood there, stunned into silence. My father chimed in from his recliner, not even looking away from the TV. He told me that I should be proud to help Ebony. He said that since I wasn't married and didn't have children, I had disposable income that Ebony needed more than I did. They twisted the narrative so fast it made my head spin. In their eyes, Ebony wasn't a criminal for committing identity theft and fraud. I was the villain for catching her. I was the bad guy for keeping score. That was the moment I realized that in the Jenkins household, the truth didn't matter. Only the image mattered. And I was expected to bankrupt myself to maintain it. I looked at my mother and told her that fraud was a felony, not a misunderstanding. I reached for my phone to dial the police. I told them I was not going to let my credit score be destroyed because Ebony wanted to play dress up. That was when the emotional blackmail began. My mother didn't just cry. She fell to her knees in the middle of the living room. She grabbed my ankles, sobbing so violently her body shook. She screamed that if I sent Ebony to prison, I would be killing her. She said the shame would destroy the family name in the church and that she would take a bottle of sleeping pills before she saw her baby girl in handcuffs. My father stood over me, clutching his chest, claiming I was giving him a heart attack. He said that family protects family, no matter what. They backed me into a corner where the only way out was to sacrifice myself. I looked at their desperate faces and I broke. I relented. I made a deal with the devil. I told them I would pay off the $82,000. I would clear the debt so Ebony wouldn't have a criminal record. But there were conditions, strict ones. Ebony had to cut up the cards. She had to get a real job. She had to prove she could be a contributing member of society. For 2 years, I thought the plan was working. I paid the bills silently. I rebuilt my credit. Then came the engagement to Connor. My parents told me Ebony had changed. They said she was marrying a good man and wanted to open a sustainable fashion boutique to support her new family. They sat me down last week and begged for one final investment. They said, "Nia, if you give her the startup capital, she will never ask you for a dime again." That is what the $100,000 check was for. It was not a wedding gift. It was business capital. It was the final lifeline I extended to a sister who I thought was finally turning her life around. I gave it to them on the condition that it would be used to secure a lease for her shop. But as I sat in my car earlier today, watching them party in a venue that cost exactly $100,000, I realized the truth. There was no shop. There was no business plan. They had taken my lifeline and used it to throw a party where they could pretend to be rich while treating the investor like the help. They didn't just steal my money this time. They stole my hope. The digital clock on my nightstand read 1:17 in the morning when the pounding started. It was not a polite knock. It was a rhythmic, aggressive thumping against my heavy oak front door that shook the walls of my foyer. I wrapped my silk robe tighter around myself and grabbed my phone to check the security feed. Standing in my hallway, bathed in the grainy black and white light of the camera, was my father, Marcus. He was still wearing his tuxedo from the wedding, but the bow tie was undone, hanging around his neck like a noose, and his white shirt was stained with the brown mud I had sprayed on him hours earlier. He looked disheveled, frantic, and dangerous. I walked to the door and unlocked the deadbolt. I did not put on the chain. I wanted him to see me standing in my own home in the luxury I paid for, unafraid of him. I swung the door open. The smell of cheap scotch and stale desperation hit me instantly. My father swayed slightly, grabbing the doorframe to steady himself. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with red, and filled with a mixture of rage and panic. He did not say hello. He did not ask if I was okay after driving off. He simply lunged forward, invading my personal space. "You give me that check right now, Nia," he slurred, his voice echoing in the quiet hallway. "You have absolutely no idea what you have done. You have started a fire that I cannot put out. Connor's parents are asking questions. They are asking why the big donation was pulled. They are starting to sniff around the finances." I stood my ground, crossing my arms over my chest. I asked him why that mattered, if everything was as legitimate as they claimed. My father slammed his hand against the wall. "Do not play games with me," he shouted. "You know exactly what is at stake. The Oldfields are old money. They are suspicious people. Mrs. Patricia was asking about the trust fund all night. If you do not give me that money back so I can deposit it and show them proof of assets, this whole thing falls apart. Do you want your sister to be humiliated? Do you want Connor to annul this marriage before the honeymoon even starts?" He was sweating profusely, the perspiration dripping down his forehead. He looked less like a patriarch and more like a cornered animal. He pointed a shaking finger in my face. "You are going to go into that safe of yours, get that check, and write a new one. And then you are going to call Mrs. Patricia and tell her it was a misunderstanding, a bad joke. Or so help me God, Nia, you will regret it." I looked at this man who had supposedly raised me. I didn't see authority anymore. I saw a gambler who had bet everything on a lie and lost. He wasn't worried about Ebony's happiness or her marriage. He was terrified that his golden ticket out of debt was about to walk away. He was terrified that the house of cards he had built on my back was finally collapsing. I looked him dead in the eye and told him, "That sounds like a personal problem." When I said those words, something in my father broke. He didn't just get angry, he shattered. He slammed his fist against the doorframe so hard I heard the wood crack. The pretense of the wealthy, dignified father evaporated, replaced by a terrified man drowning in his own lies. He grabbed my shoulders, his grip bruising, and screamed right into my face, "This is not a game, Nia. The warehouse property on 5th Street is already gone. I mortgaged it 3 times. The bank sent the foreclosure notice last week. If I do not have that $100,000 to pay the balloon payment by Tuesday morning, we lose the house. We lose the cars. We lose everything. We will be on the street." I froze. The warehouse he was talking about was a dilapidated piece of commercial property he had held onto for decades, always claiming it was his retirement gold mine. In reality, it was just collateral for his bad decisions. I looked into his bloodshot eyes and finally understood the full picture. The wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was a cover-up. They had spent money they didn't have to impress people who didn't care, all while the ground beneath their feet was crumbling. "So that is it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You lied to the Oldfields. You told Connor and his parents that we were wealthy. You told them that the warehouse was a developing asset, didn't you? You sold them a fairy tale about generational wealth, and you needed my money to keep the lights on long enough for the ink to dry on the marriage license." My father slumped against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on my floor, weeping into his hands. He didn't deny it. He just kept muttering that I didn't understand, that appearances were everything in this world. But I understood perfectly. They weren't just financially bankrupt. They were morally bankrupt. They were willing to bleed me dry not to start a business, but to save themselves from the consequences of their own vanity. I looked at the man sobbing on my floor and realized I didn't feel pity. I felt disgust. He wasn't crying because he was sorry. He was crying because he had been caught. I reached down and picked up my phone from the floor where it had fallen during his outburst. My hand was steady, terrified but controlled. I did not offer him a hand up. I did not offer him a glass of water. Instead, I tapped the screen and opened the voice recorder app. I pressed the red button and held the device between us like a shield. I asked him to repeat what he had just said. I told him to say it clearly for the record, so that when the bank comes looking for assets, I have proof that I was not involved in his fraud." My father looked at the phone, and the pathetic, weeping facade instantly vanished. He scrambled to his feet, wiping the tears from his face with the back of his muddy hand. His eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom. He asked me if I was really going to record my own father. He asked if I had no shame. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that shame was a luxury we could no longer afford. I told him that I had spent my entire adult life trying to buy his approval, but I finally realized that his love was just a subscription service that I was tired of renewing. I took a step back, creating distance between us. I told him that the foreclosure of his house was not my emergency. I told him that his lies to the Oldfield family were not my burden to carry. "That is the price of vanity, Marcus," I said, using his first name for the first time in my life. "You spent 30 years trying to look rich instead of actually building wealth, and now the bill has come due. I am not going to pay it." He stepped forward, his fists clenched, looking like he might strike me. I didn't flinch. I held the phone higher and spoke with a voice that was cold as ice. I told him he had exactly 10 seconds to get off my property. I told him that if he was not on the other side of that door by the time I counted down, I would call the police and file charges for harassment and trespassing. I reminded him that with his current financial situation, he could not afford bail. 1, 2, 3. My father stared at me, searching for a trace of the obedient daughter he used to manipulate. He found nothing but a stranger. He let out a string of curses that would make a sailor blush. He called me a bitter, lonely woman who would die alone with her money. He spat on my marble floor, right at my feet. Then he turned around and stumbled out into the hallway, slamming the heavy oak door behind him so hard that the frame rattled. I didn't move until I heard the elevator chime ding, signaling he was gone. Then I walked over to the door. I threw the deadbolt. I engaged the chain. I turned the security alarm on. For the first time in 29 years, I wasn't just locking my door to keep strangers out. I was locking it to keep my family out. I slid down against the wood of the door, sitting on the cold floor of my foyer. I didn't cry. I just listened to the silence. It was the first time in my life I truly understood that peace is expensive, but it is worth every single penny. I looked at the recording on my phone. I had the evidence. The war had officially begun. The morning sun hit my floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the quiet sanctuary of my penthouse. I had slept surprisingly well for a woman who had just declared war on her entire lineage. I reached for my phone, expecting to see more vitriol from my cousins or perhaps a guilt-tripping voicemail from my mother. Instead, a text message popped up from a number I rarely heard from. It was Connor, the groom. My brother-in-law is a decent man, the kind of guy who opens doors for strangers and believes the best in people. Unfortunately, his upbringing in the sheltered world of Connecticut old money made him an easy mark for predators like my sister. I unlocked the screen, bracing myself for a confrontation. But as I read his words, my jaw actually dropped. "Nia, are you feeling better? Ebony told me about the severe food poisoning. I am so sorry. I had no idea you were hallucinating from the fever when you went up to the stage. Please do not worry about the mix-up with the envelope. We can get that donation check back to the Red Cross later. Just focus on resting and getting those toxins out of your system." I stared at the phone, blinking in disbelief. I had to give it to Ebony. She was a masterclass in manipulation. In the panic of last night, She had managed to spin a narrative so audacious that it defied logic. She had convinced her husband that I wasn't an angry investor reclaiming my capital. No, in her twisted version of reality, I was a sick, delirious woman who had eaten bad shrimp and confused a wedding gift with a charity donation for the Red Cross. It was the perfect lie. It explained why I took the money without making them look like thieves. It explained my dramatic exit without addressing the abuse I suffered. And most importantly, it painted Ebony as the saintly, concerned sister who was covering for my embarrassing medical episode. It turned my moment of empowerment into a moment of pity. I started to type a furious reply. I wanted to tell him that I hadn't eaten a single thing because his wife had starved me. I wanted to tell him that the only toxin in my system was my family. I wanted to scream that the check was never for charity. But my thumb hovered over the send button. If I texted him the truth now, Ebony would just intercept it. She would tell him I was still delirious. She would gaslight him until he believed her over me. I realized then that a text message wasn't going to cut it. This lie was too big, too entrenched. To destroy a fabrication this elaborate, I couldn't just tell him the truth. I had to show him. I deleted the draft. I needed to get back into the lion's den. I needed a venue where Ebony couldn't hide, where her lies would crumble under the weight of hard evidence. I put the phone down and waited. I knew the invitation was coming. They needed that check back, and they would play nice to get it. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, my phone rang. It wasn't Connor. It was the matriarch herself, Mrs. Patricia. The trap was set. I watched the phone ring on the marble countertop. The caller ID displayed the name Patricia Oldfield. This was it. The heavy artillery. My mother and sister were sloppy with their manipulation, using guilt and tantrums. But Patricia was different. She was a woman who wielded politeness like a loaded weapon. She didn't scream. She whispered. And her whispers could destroy reputations. I took a deep breath, swiped accept, and put the phone to my ear. "Hello, Mrs. Oldfield," I said, keeping my voice steady and professional. "Nia, darling, please, call me Patricia," she purred. Her voice was smooth, cultured, and dripping with fake concern. It sounded like old money and judgment. "We were just so devastated to hear about your sudden medical episode at the reception last night. Ebony tells us you were quite delirious. It must have been terrible to be so confused that you took back a gift meant for charity." I almost laughed out loud. She was smooth. In 3 sentences, she had reinforced the lie, labeled me as mentally unstable, and subtly demanded the money back without ever raising her voice. She was giving me an out. She was offering me a chance to play along with the sick girl narrative so that everyone could save face. All I had to do was agree, show up, and write a new check. "I am feeling much better now, thank you," I replied, playing the game. "I am so relieved to hear that," she continued. "Listen, dear, we are hosting a very private, intimate brunch at the estate this afternoon. Just the immediate family. Connor, Ebony, your parents, and us. We simply cannot have you sitting alone in that apartment after such a trauma. And, of course, we need to sort out the logistics of the wedding financials before the children leave for the Maldives tomorrow. I insist you come. We can put this whole ugly misunderstanding behind us." It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. She was calling me into the principal's office. She wanted to get me onto her territory, surrounded by my enemies, where she believed the pressure of her opulent lifestyle and her stern glare would force me to submit. She thought I was the same desperate people pleaser my parents were. She thought I would be intimidated by her gate code and her butlers. "I would love to come, Patricia," I said. "I think a family meeting is exactly what we need right now." "Wonderful," she said, the steel returning to her voice. "We will see you at noon. Do not be late. The gate will be open for you." I hung up the phone and walked to my closet. I knew exactly what this was. It was an ambush. They expected me to walk in there with my tail between my legs, apologize for my delirium, and hand over the money to keep the peace. They expected the scapegoat to return to the herd. I pulled out a tailored white power suit. It was sharp, architectural, and completely business. I wasn't going to a brunch to eat quiche and sip mimosas. I was going to a deposition. I checked my bag to make sure I had the file from the private investigator. I had 3 copies. One for me, one for Connor, and one for the woman who thought she could bully me into submission. I looked in the mirror and applied a coat of red lipstick. I was walking into the lion's den, but they forgot one important thing. I was the one bringing the fire. I walked into my home office and sat down at the heavy mahogany desk. This room was the command center of my design business, the place where I built my fortune. But today, it was going to be a war room. I picked up my phone again and dialed a number I had saved under the name Mr. Vance. He was the private investigator I had hired 2 years ago when the identity theft first happened. He was expensive, discreet, and terrifyingly thorough. He picked up on the second ring. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice gravelly and serious. "I assume you are calling because you finally want to unseal the file." I told him he assumed correctly. I asked him to email me the full dossier on Ebony Jenkins immediately. I told him to include everything: the police reports from the fraud investigation, the surveillance photos from the boutiques, and the credit card statements with the forged signatures. Then I paused. I asked him if he still had the supplementary medical background check he performed when we were trying to determine if she was spending the stolen money on drugs. Mr. Vance confirmed he did. He asked if I wanted the records from the clinic in Mexico included in the PDF. I told him yes. I told him especially that document. That single piece of paper was the nuclear option. I had sat on it for 3 years, protecting Ebony's privacy because, despite everything, she was my sister. But she had lost the right to privacy when she tried to destroy my reputation and steal my money. A moment later, my inbox pinged. I opened the file. It was over 50 pages of cold, hard evidence. I hit the print button. The laser printer whirred to life, the rhythmic sound filling the room like a heartbeat. One by one, the sheets of paper slid into the tray. First came the financial records, the undeniable proof of her criminal history. Then came the emails between my parents and the bank, acknowledging the fraud, but begging for leniency. And finally, the medical records. I organized the documents into 3 neat stacks. I placed each stack into a plain black presentation folder. I labeled them in my mind. One for Patricia Oldfield, the woman who valued pedigree above all else. One for Connor, the husband who was sleeping next to a stranger. And one for my parents, a reminder of the monster they had created and protected. I ran my hand over the cover of the top folder. It felt heavy. I knew that once I handed these out, there was no going back. I wasn't just exposing a lie. I was likely ending a marriage and severing ties with my family forever. A small part of me, the part that still remembered playing dolls with Ebony when we were 5, felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered the yellow badge. I remembered the hunger pangs in the tent. I remembered my father spitting on my floor. I slid the 3 black folders into my oversized designer tote bag. I grabbed my car keys. The guilt vanished, replaced by the cold steel of determination. I wasn't starting a fight. I was finishing one. The GPS led me away from the city and into the hills of Barrington, where the driveways were longer than most city blocks. The Oldfield estate wasn't just a house. It was a fortress of generational wealth built from limestone and intimidation. As I pulled my Porsche up the winding gravel driveway, lined with manicured boxwood hedges that looked like they were trimmed with nail scissors, I understood why my parents were so desperate. Marrying into this family wasn't just a love match. It was a financial rescue mission. A butler who looked like he had been embalmed in the 19th century opened the massive front door before I could even knock. He didn't smile. He simply took my coat with a gloved hand and gestured toward the drawing room. The house was silent in a way that only massive old houses are. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy. It smelled of lemon polish, beeswax, and judgment. My heels clicked loudly on the marble checkerboard floor, announcing my arrival like a gunshot in a library. I stepped into the drawing room, a space filled with oil paintings of ancestors who looked like they owned people. The scene before me was almost comical. My parents, Marcus and Denise, were sitting on a silk brocade sofa perched on the very edge of the cushions, as if they were afraid to wrinkle the fabric. My father was holding a delicate china teacup with a trembling hand, his pinky finger extended in a caricature of high society manners. My mother was nodding vigorously at everything being said, her smile frozen and terrified. They looked like actors who had forgotten their lines in the middle of a play. And then there was Ebony. She was curled up in a wing-back armchair, wearing a white cashmere sweater that I knew cost more than her rent. She was playing the role of the fragile, recovering victim to perfection. On her left hand, resting conspicuously on the armrest, was the engagement ring. It was huge. As the sunlight from the floor-to-ceiling windows hit it, the stone fractured the light in a way that made my professional eye twitch. I knew diamonds. I knew clarity and cut. And looking at that rock from 20 feet away, I knew it was either a high-grade lab-created stone or financed on a credit plan with an interest rate that would make a loan shark blush. Connor sat on the arm of her chair, looking protective and concerned, completely unaware that he was guarding a wolf in sheep's clothing. Across from them sat Patricia Oldfield. She didn't need to posture. She sat with the relaxed, predatory confidence of a woman who owned the deed to the land and everyone on it. When I walked in, the conversation stopped abruptly. My mother looked at me with a pleading expression that said, "Please do not ruin this." Ebony looked at me with a smirk that said, "You cannot touch me here." I tightened my grip on my tote bag. They thought the scary part was the house. They didn't realize the scary part was walking through the door. The brunch service was an exercise in pretension. Silent waiters placed plates of microscopic quiche and artisanal fruit in front of us with the solemnity of a religious ceremony. I unfolded my linen napkin, acutely aware that Patricia Oldfield was watching my every move, waiting for me to use the wrong fork or chew too loudly. She took a delicate sip of her tea, placed the cup back on the saucer with a sharp clink, and fired the first shot across the bow. "So, Nia," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, "Ebony tells us you are a decorator. It must be such a quaint little hobby. I suppose picking out throw pillows and curtains keeps you busy, but it must be terribly difficult to make a real living in such a subjective field." I sliced my quiche calmly. I corrected her gently, stating that I was not a decorator, but the owner of a commercial interior architecture firm. I explained that we handle structural renovations for luxury hotels and corporate headquarters. Patricia waved her hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. Well, whatever you call it, it is certainly not high finance, is it? She turned to smile at Ebony, who was looking increasingly nauseous. We are just so proud of Ebony. Managing a hedge fund requires such intellect and responsibility. Dealing with millions of dollars of other people's money is a heavy burden, isn't it, darling? I almost choked on my water. The irony was suffocating. Ebony had never managed a fund in her life. The only thing she had ever managed was to defraud her own sister. But my parents nodded vigorously, backing up the lie. My father chimed in, saying that Ebony had always been the numbers whiz of the family, while I was more of the artistic, free-spirit type. Patricia turned her gaze back to me, her eyes narrowing. It is good that you have a wealthy sister, then. I imagine you must struggle to scrape together enough pennies to pay rent in the city. It must be humbling to be the poor relation. The table went silent. This was it. She was trying to shame me into submission, trying to remind me of my place. I wiped my mouth with the napkin and looked Patricia dead in the eye. I smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that made my mother gasp. Actually, Patricia, I do quite well, I said, my voice steady and clear. My business is very profitable. In fact, I make enough money to clean up surprisingly large messes. I have spent the last few years paying off significant debts for petty thieves who stole my identity. You would be amazed at how expensive it is to keep people out of prison. The effect was instantaneous. Ebony dropped her silver fork onto her china plate with a loud crash that echoed through the dining room. She went pale, her eyes darting frantically between me and Connor. My father started coughing violently, choking on his tea. My mother looked like she was about to faint. Patricia looked confused by the sudden tension. Thieves? She asked, raising an eyebrow. How dreadful! I hope the police caught the criminals. I took a sip of my water, locking eyes with Ebony. Oh, I caught them, I said. I decided to handle it privately, but lately I am thinking that was a mistake. Some criminals do not learn their lesson until they are exposed. Connor placed his hand over Ebony's, looking at my father with the earnest, trusting expression of a golden retriever. He smiled and said, Mr. Jenkins, actually, since we are all here discussing finances, I wanted to confirm the details for next week. My financial advisor was asking about the maturation date of the family trust. You mentioned that the $2 million portfolio matures on Tuesday and that the transfer for our house down payment would be initiated then. The water I was sipping went down the wrong pipe. I had to physically cover my mouth with the linen napkin to keep from sputtering. $2 million. My parents, who were currently dodging calls from collection agencies and facing foreclosure on a warehouse worth $0, had not just promised a gift. They had invented an entire multi-million-dollar trust fund. It was a lie so massive, so easily disprovable, that it bordered on psychosis. I looked at Marcus. He had stopped breathing. His face had drained of all color, leaving him looking gray and sickly against the dark wood of the dining chairs. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple and dripped onto his stiff collar. My mother, Denise, had abandoned her smile entirely. She was staring at her plate, gripping her silverware so hard her knuckles were white. They were terrified. They had promised a fortune they did not have, likely banking on the hope that I would bail them out again, or that they could stall Connor with excuses once the wedding was legally binding. Patricia didn't notice their panic, or perhaps she did and enjoyed it. She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with greed. Yes, Marcus, she said, The liquidity event. We are all so looking forward to seeing the young couple settled in their new estate. It is so rare to find a family that values generational wealth as much as we do. It was insane. It was delusional. They had dug a hole so deep they could see the center of the earth, and they were still digging. They were hoping, praying that I would write another check or that a miracle would happen before Tuesday. But there are no miracles for liars. I set my glass down on the table with a deliberate, audible click. I looked at my father, whose eyes were pleading with me to stay silent, to play along with this insanity one last time. But I was done playing. I wasn't going to let them commit grand larceny by deception. I cleared my throat, ready to speak, but Ebony, sensing the walls closing in, decided to play her final, desperate card. Ebony saw the skepticism in Patricia's eyes regarding the money, and she did what she always does when cornered. She improvised. She let out a soft, shaky sigh and placed her left hand, the one weighed down by the questionable diamond, protectively over her flat stomach. She looked up at Connor with wide, glistening eyes and lowered her voice to a whisper that was perfectly pitched to be heard by everyone at the table. She said, "Connor, baby, please stop interrogating Daddy about the trust fund. It does not matter. The only thing that matters right now is that I stay calm for the sake of baby Jenkins Smith. The doctor said stress is terrible for the first trimester." The effect was instantaneous and nauseating. Connor's face transformed from confusion to pure, unadulterated adoration. He looked at her as if she were the Virgin Mary herself. He dropped his fork and wrapped his arm around her shoulders, apologizing profusely. Even Patricia, the woman made of ice and judgment, softened. Her eyes darted to Ebony's stomach, her mind undoubtedly racing with thoughts of an heir to the Oldfield fortune. A smile actually cracked her porcelain face. My parents, Marcus and Denise, slumped back in their chairs, visibly exhaling. They looked like they had just dodged a bullet. They knew there was no trust fund, but they figured this lie bought them at least 9 months of safety. I sat there, frozen, my hand gripping the stem of my water glass so hard I thought it might shatter. This was a new low. Financial fraud was one thing. Lying about a human life to trap a man into a marriage was entirely different. It was predatory. It was evil. And most importantly, I knew for a fact it was physically impossible. My mind flashed back to 3 years ago. I remembered the clinic in Tijuana. I remembered holding Ebony's hand while she cried, not because she wanted children, but because she wanted to ensure she never ruined her figure with a pregnancy. I remembered paying the $5,000 bill for the tubal ligation because she didn't want it on our parents' insurance. I looked at Connor, a good man who was about to build a life on a foundation of sand. He was rubbing her back, whispering promises to protect her and their unborn child. He had no idea he was comforting a woman who had voluntarily sterilized herself before she was 25. The rage inside me didn't feel hot anymore. It felt cold. It felt clinical. I realized that if I stayed silent now, I wasn't just a bystander. I was an accomplice to entrapment. I looked at my mother, who avoided my gaze. She knew too. She knew everything. And she was letting this happen to secure a connection to the Oldfield money. I reached down to the floor and picked up my heavy tote bag. I felt the sharp corners of the black presentation folders inside. They were heavy with the truth. I placed the bag on my lap. I didn't wait for the happy reactions over the fake baby to die down. I leaned forward, my voice cutting through the sentimental atmosphere like a scalpel. I said, "That is wonderful news, Ebony. Truly. But before we start planning the baby shower, I think there are a few documents Connor needs to see. Because in my experience, the only thing that grows in the dark is mold, not miracles. I stood up from the table, my movements deliberate and slow. The joy in the room regarding the imaginary baby was suffocating, a thick fog of delusion that I was about to clear with a hurricane. I walked over to the massive mahogany sideboard where the remote control for the 85-inch television lay. I picked it up, feeling the cool metal in my hand. It wasn't just a remote anymore. It was the detonator. "Since we are discussing the future," I said, my voice calm but carrying a dangerous edge. "And since we are celebrating the arrival of the Jenkins Smith heir and the maturation of the family trust, I realized I have a wedding gift that I forgot to give you yesterday. It is a digital presentation. I think it will clarify everything regarding our family's assets and history." Ebony stopped fake rubbing her stomach. Her eyes widened, realizing exactly what kind of history I had on my phone. My father half rose from his chair, his napkin falling to the floor. "Nia, sit down," he barked, his voice cracking with panic. "We are eating. This is not the time for your little slideshows." "Oh, I think it is the perfect time," I countered. I tapped the screen mirroring icon on my phone. The massive screen on the wall flickered to life, displaying the spinning wheel of the AirPlay connection. "Patricia, you wanted to know about the Jenkins legacy, didn't you? You wanted to know where Ebony gets her financial acumen?" Patricia, driven by her insatiable need to inspect the goods she was buying, waved her hand at my father. "Sit down, Marcus," she commanded. "Let the girl show us. I enjoy a good family retrospective. It might show us if the baby will have your nose." The irony was delicious. She was inviting the executioner in. My phone vibrated as it synced with the Wi-Fi. The room went silent, the kind of silence that happens right before a car crash. I looked at Ebony one last time. I gave her a chance to confess, a split second to stop this by telling the truth herself. But she just stared at me with hatred, convinced I wouldn't dare. She was wrong. The screen blinked, the spinning wheel stopped, and the pixels rearranged themselves to reveal the first image. It wasn't a baby photo. It wasn't a wedding memory. It was a high-resolution scan of a document that had been stamped in red ink. I stepped back, allowing the glow of the television to illuminate the terrified faces of my family. The show had officially begun. The 85-inch screen illuminated the dining room with a harsh, unforgiving white light. It displayed a PDF document that was painfully familiar to anyone who has ever hit rock bottom, but completely foreign to people like the Oldfields. At the top, in bold, terrifying red letters, was the logo of the National Bank, followed by the words, "Notice of Default and Foreclosure Proceedings." Below that, in clear black type, was the address of the house my parents were currently sitting in. I walked toward the screen, acting like a weatherman predicting a hurricane. I pointed to the date stamped in the corner. "As you can see, this notice was served 3 months ago." I turned to look at Patricia, whose mouth was slightly agape. "You asked about the liquidity event scheduled for next Tuesday. You were absolutely right to be curious. There is indeed a major financial event happening on Tuesday. It is the day the bank officially auctions off this property to the highest bidder because the mortgage has not been paid in 6 months." The silence in the room was deafening. It was broken only by the sound of my mother's teacup rattling against its saucer as her hands shook uncontrollably. Connor squinted at the screen, reading the numbers. He looked like a child trying to solve a complex math problem. "But," he stammered, his voice weak, "but Mr. Jenkins said there was a trust fund. He said there was $2 million maturing." I swiped the screen on my phone, and the image on the TV changed. This time, it was a credit report. The score was highlighted in yellow, 420. It listed judgments, liens, and a mountain of credit card debt. "There is no trust fund, Connor," I said, my voice devoid of any sympathy. "There is no portfolio. There is no inheritance. The only thing maturing next Tuesday is a $500,000 debt that my father was hoping my $100,000 check would delay for another month. The wealth you think you are marrying into is a mirage. They are not just broke. They are insolvent." My father slammed his hand on the table, knocking over the creamer. "That is private information!" he roared, trying to stand up, but his legs seemed to fail him. He looked small. The bravado he had worn like a suit of armor was gone, leaving behind a desperate, aging con man. Patricia turned her head slowly to look at my parents. The warmth was gone from her eyes, replaced by the cold, calculating look of a woman who realizes she has been sold a counterfeit purse. "So," she whispered, her voice like cracking ice. "The vineyard wedding, the designer dresses. It was all—" "What? A performance?" "It was a bait and switch, Patricia," I answered for them, "and unfortunately, you and Connor were the marks. But financial ruin is just the tip of the iceberg. If you think being broke is bad, wait until you see where the money actually went." I swiped the screen again. The silence in the dining room was shattered by the sound of Patricia's chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. It sounded like a bone snapping. The matriarch of the Oldfield family didn't just stand up. She rose like a tidal wave preparing to crash down on a small, unsuspecting village. Her face, usually a mask of pale, aristocratic boredom, was now flushed a deep, alarming shade of crimson. She gripped the edge of the table with hands that were adorned with real diamonds, her knuckles white with rage. She didn't look at me. She looked directly at my parents, her eyes drilling holes into their frantic, sweating faces. "Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins?" Patricia said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the fury of a woman who realizes she has been played. "What is the meaning of this?" She pointed a shaking finger at the 85-inch screen where the foreclosure notice was still glowing like a neon sign of shame. "You sat in my home, you drank my wine, and you looked me in the eye and spoke of trust funds and portfolios. Are you telling me that you are not just liquidating an asset, but that you are destitute?" My father, Marcus, looked like he was having a stroke. He loosened his bow tie, gasping for air. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a wet, pathetic wheeze. "Now, Patricia, please," he stammered, wiping sweat from his upper lip with a linen napkin that was now stained with his desperation. "You have to understand. Nia she is very good with computers. She has always been jealous of Ebony." "This is obviously a fabrication. It is a Photoshop job. A prank. She is trying to sabotage the union because she is bitter about being single." My mother, Denise, latched onto this lie like a drowning woman grabbing a piece of driftwood. "Yes! Yes, exactly!" she cried out, her voice shrill and piercing. "Oh, Patricia, you know how sibling rivalry can be. Nia has always been the black sheep. She created this fake document to embarrass us. We are perfectly solvent. The trust fund is real." I watched them spin their web, amazed at their stamina. Even when faced with hard evidence, their instinct was to deny, deflect, and demonize me. But Patricia Oldfield was not a fool. She was a woman who sat on the boards of 3 charities and managed the family estate. She knew what a foreclosure notice looked like. She walked around the table, her heels clicking ominously, until she was standing right over my father. "Do not insult my intelligence, Marcus," she hissed. "I know the difference between a forgery and a federal notice. I recognize the case number format, and I recognize the look of a man who is lying." She turned to Connor, who was sitting there with his mouth open, looking back and forth between the screen and his in-laws like a spectator at a tennis match. "Connor, check the public records on your phone, right now. Search the county clerk's database for the Jenkins property." My father reached out to stop him, shouting, "No!" But it was too late. Connor, for the first time, looked at his father-in-law with suspicion. He pulled out his phone. The room went silent again for 10 agonizing seconds. Then, Connor looked up, his face pale. "It is true, Mom," he whispered. "The list pendens was filed 3 months ago. The auction is set for Tuesday at 9 a.m. Patricia let out a short, sharp laugh that had no humor in it. She looked at my parents with pure disgust. "You didn't want a marriage," she said. "You wanted a bailout. You have been parading around like royalty when you are nothing but beggars in rented tuxedos." My parents shrank into their chairs. The game was up. The financial lie was dead. But I wasn't done. I looked at the remote in my hand. I knew that losing the money was embarrassing, but what I was about to show next would turn that embarrassment into a criminal investigation. I looked at Ebony, who was trembling. I swiped the screen. The image of the foreclosure notice dissolved, fading into the next slide with a smooth, digital transition that felt violently out of place in the tense room. The new image was grainy, black and white, and undeniable. It was a scanned copy of a police incident report filed 2 years ago in Chicago. Beside it, I had enlarged the list of charges: identity theft, credit card fraud, and forgery. I walked closer to the television, my shadow casting a long silhouette over the table. "Patricia, you mentioned earlier how proud you were of Ebony's career in high finance. You said she had a knack for managing other people's money." I paused, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. "You were partially right. She is excellent at spending other people's money. She just usually forgets to ask for permission first." Ebony let out a strangled noise, half gasp, half sob. She tried to lunge for the remote on the sideboard, but I was faster. I stepped between her and the device, my body blocking her path. I pointed to the screen. "That is not a resume, Ebony. That is a rap sheet." I turned back to the Oldfields. "The police report you are looking at details a series of felonies committed against me. 2 years ago, my loving sister stole my Social Security number and opened 5 credit cards in my name. She racked up $82,000 in debt, buying designer handbags and vacations, ruining my credit score in the process. I didn't press charges because my parents begged me not to. They said it would ruin her future. So, I paid every cent of it to keep her out of jail." Patricia looked at the screen, reading the details. Her face was no longer red. It was a ghost white. She looked at Ebony with a mixture of horror and realization. The pieces were falling into place. The vague job description, the lack of verifiable work history, the constant need for loans. "But she told us she worked for a boutique firm in the city," Connor whispered, his voice trembling. "She said she managed a private equity portfolio." I looked at my brother-in-law with genuine pity. "Connor, the only thing Ebony manages is a scheme. She doesn't have a job. She hasn't had a job in 4 years. The office she goes to? It is a coffee shop where she scrolls through Instagram and looks for new ways to spend money she doesn't have. She isn't a financial expert. She is a professional liability. I took a step toward him. He looked like a man waking up from a long, beautiful dream into a nightmare. I lowered my voice, making it personal. You need to wake up, Connor. If she was willing to steal the identity of the sister who raised her, what do you think she is doing to you? You have given her access to your accounts. You added her to your credit cards. You think you are building a life with a partner, but you are just her new host. I nodded toward his jacket draped over the back of his chair. If I were you, I would check your wallet right now. Check your recent transactions. Because I guarantee you, the honeymoon money isn't sitting in a savings account. It is probably already on her wrist or hidden in an offshore account. Connor stared at me, then slowly turned his head to look at Ebony. She was weeping now, mascara running down her face, mumbling that I was a liar, that I was jealous. But she didn't deny the police report. She couldn't. The case number was right there in black and white. Connor reached for his jacket. His hand was shaking as he pulled out his phone to check his banking app. The room held its breath. I watched Ebony's face crumble. She knew what he was going to find. But I wasn't finished. I had one more slide. The slide that would burn the bridge permanently. Connor was still staring at his phone, his face gray as he looked at the transaction history that confirmed my previous warnings, but I didn't give him time to process the theft. I had one final nail to drive into the coffin of this marriage. I swiped the screen on my phone one last time. The grainy police report dissolved, replaced by a scanned medical document with a blue seal from the Mexican Ministry of Health. It was a discharge summary from the Santa Maria Clinic in Tijuana, dated 3 years ago. I walked over to the television and pointed to the line labeled Procedimiento. The words bilateral tubal ligation were typed clearly in the center of the page. I turned to look at the room. I know not everyone speaks Spanish or medical terminology, so let me translate, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. This is a record of a voluntary surgical sterilization. Ebony let out a sound that was less like a cry and more like a wounded animal. She curled into a ball in her chair, burying her face in her hands. My mother, Denise, closed her eyes and turned her head away, unable to watch the final, most damning lie unravel. I looked directly at Connor, who was staring at the screen with a look of absolute incomprehension. There is no baby Jenkins Smith, Connor. There never was. And unless there is a medical miracle I am unaware of, there never will be. Ebony had this procedure done when she was 23. I know because I drove her to the airport. She told me explicitly that she didn't want to ruin her model figure with stretch marks. She said children were a burden she didn't want to carry. I turned to Patricia, who was looking at Ebony's stomach with a look of pure horror. She isn't protecting an heir, Patricia. She is protecting a scam. She invented a high-risk pregnancy to stop you from asking questions about the money. She used your desire for a grandchild as a shield to hide her bankruptcy. She knew you wouldn't kick a pregnant woman out of the family, so she created one. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Connor stood up slowly. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. He looked at Ebony, his eyes searching her face for any sign of denial, any sign that I was lying. Ebony, he whispered, his voice cracking. Please tell me this is fake. Tell me you didn't lie about our baby. Ebony looked up, her face a mess of black tears and snot. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin another web, but she couldn't. The document on the screen was signed by her. The date was undeniable. She just sobbed, a raw, ugly sound of defeat. That silence was the confirmation. Connor looked down at his hand. He slowly slid his wedding band off his finger. He didn't throw it. He just dropped it onto the table. It hit the wood with a dull thud that sounded like a gavel ending a life sentence. He looked at my parents, then at Ebony, and said simply, "Get out of my house." The silence in the room shattered instantly. The exposure of her medical history was the breaking point. Ebony did not cry or beg for forgiveness. She snapped. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She let out a primal shriek that echoed off the high ceilings, a sound so full of venom it made the hair on my arms stand up. She didn't care about the foreclosure or the fraud anymore. She only wanted to destroy the person who had taken off her mask. She lunged across the table, knocking over crystal glasses and sending the centerpiece crashing to the floor. She wasn't running. She was hunting. Her manicured nails were aimed directly at my eyes. I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, ready to defend myself. But I didn't have to. Before she could reach me, a strong arm caught her around the waist. It was Connor. He didn't hold her like a husband comforting a distraught wife. He held her like a prison guard restraining an inmate. He hauled her back, his grip tightening as she thrashed and kicked, screaming obscenities at me that would make a sailor blush. Connor dragged her away from me, spinning her around so she was forced to look at him. "Stop it!" he roared, his voice booming with a command I had never heard from him before. Ebony froze, panting heavily, her chest heaving against his. The room was deadly quiet again, save for the sound of jagged breathing. Connor looked down at her, but there was no love left in his eyes. There was only confusion and a dawning, horrifying realization. He was holding her close, his hands pressed against her midsection to keep her steady. He frowned, looking down at his hands. He pressed his fingers into her stomach. Then he pressed harder. A look of absolute revulsion washed over his face. Human flesh gives way and bounces back. It is warm, it is firm, but what Connor felt under his hands did not feel like skin or muscle. It felt like memory foam. He stepped back, as if he had been burned, releasing her so abruptly she stumbled. He reached out with a trembling hand and, before she could slap it away, he yanked up the hem of her cashmere sweater. There was no skin. There was a peach-colored, silicone prosthetic strapped around her waist with Velcro. It was a high-end prop, the kind actresses use in movies, designed to mimic a 3-month bump. The gasp from Patricia was audible. My mother buried her face in her hands, unable to witness the shame. Connor stared at the foam contraption, his eyes wide and watery. He looked at Ebony not as his wife, not as the woman he loved, but as a total stranger. He looked at her like she was a monster. "You are wearing a costume," he whispered, his voice shaking with disgust. "You are wearing a costume of our child." Ebony tried to pull her sweater down, her hands shaking, trying to cover the plastic lie. "Connor, wait, let me explain," she stammered, her voice small and pathetic. "Don't you dare speak to me," Connor spat. He backed away from her, wiping his hands on his pants as if he were trying to clean off a contagion. "You didn't just lie about money. You played with my soul. You let me talk to that stomach. You let me name it, and it was just a piece of plastic." He looked at me, then back at the woman he had married less than 24 hours ago. He pointed at the door. "Get out. Get out of my house before I throw you out." The sound of Connor's voice ordering his wife out of the house hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. For a heartbeat, the room was still. I expected my parents to rush to Ebony's side. I expected them to defend their daughter, to plead for mercy, or at least to help her up from where she had stumbled against the sideboard. After all, they were the ones who had pushed her into this charade. They were the ones who needed the foreclosure money. But I had forgotten the cardinal rule of the Jenkins family. Self-preservation is the only religion. My father, Marcus, looked at Connor's furious face, then at Patricia's icy stare. He did the math in his head instantly. The marriage was dead. The money was gone. The only thing left to save was their own skin. He didn't step toward Ebony. He stepped away from her, creating a physical distance that spoke volumes. Denise, my mother, was faster. She saw the disgust in Patricia's eyes and decided she needed to mirror it to survive. She walked over to Ebony, who was trembling, clutching the hem of her sweater over the silicone stomach. Ebony looked up at our mother, her eyes wide and wet, reaching out a hand for comfort. She whispered, "Mama, please." Denise didn't take her hand. She pulled her arm back and delivered a sharp, stinging slap across Ebony's face. The sound was sickening, a wet crack that made Connor flinch. Ebony's head snapped to the side, her hand flying to her cheek in shock. She stared at our mother, unable to process the betrayal. "You stupid, greedy girl!" Denise screamed, her voice shrill and performative. She turned to face Patricia and Connor, clasping her hands over her heart. "Oh, Patricia, you have to believe us. We had no idea it had gone this far. We told her to stop. We begged her to be honest with Connor." Ebony's mouth dropped open. "You what?" she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "You told me to do it. You drove me to the clinic. You bought the prosthetic online with Dad's credit card. Liar!" my father shouted, jumping into the fray to back up my mother's narrative. He pointed a shaking finger at Ebony. "Don't you dare drag us into your sickness. We knew you were padding your resume, yes, and we were ashamed. But we had no idea about the fake pregnancy. That is perverse, Ebony. You are sick. We only played along with the money talk because we were afraid of what you would do to yourself if we didn't. We were hostages to her instability, Connor. You have to understand. We are victims here too." I watched them, feeling a wave of nausea roll through my stomach that had nothing to do with food. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. They were cannibalizing their own child to save face. They saw the ship sinking, and instead of helping her bail water, they were drowning her to use her body as a raft. They were throwing her to the wolves, hoping the Oldfields would be too busy devouring her to notice that they were the ones who set the table. Ebony stood there, holding her cheek, looking from her mother to her father. The realization hit her harder than the slap. She had destroyed her integrity, committed felonies, and humiliated herself on a global scale to buy them a house and keep them in luxury. And in the end, they didn't love her. They just used her. She was just another maxed-out credit card to them. And now that she was declined, they were cutting her up. The look in her eyes wasn't sadness anymore. It was the hollow, dead look of someone who realizes they are completely and utterly alone in the world. The screaming match between my mother and Ebony was cut short by a sound sharper than breaking glass. Patricia Oldfield did not scream. She simply clapped her hands once. It wasn't applause. It was a command for silence that carried the weight of a judge slamming a gavel. The room fell instantly quiet, save for Ebony's ragged breathing. Patricia looked at my parents, who were panting from their theatrical performance, with an expression of absolute, unvarnished revulsion. She didn't buy their act. She looked at them like they were something she had stepped in on the sidewalk. "Save your breath, Marcus," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly low register. "Do not insult me by pretending you are victims. I have watched you enable this circus for months. You are not hostages. You are parasites. And I am fumigating my house." She reached out and pressed a small, discreet button on the wall panel near the dining entrance. Almost immediately, the heavy double doors swung open. Edwards, the head of the estate security team, stepped in, flanked by 3 large men in dark suits. They didn't look like the rental guards from the wedding. These men looked like they broke bones for a living. Patricia didn't even look at them. She just pointed a manicured finger at the trio of disasters standing by her sideboard. "Edwards, please remove these people from my property," she ordered, her tone as casual as if she were asking him to take out the trash. "They are trespassing. If they resist, or if they ever set foot near this gate again, call the sheriff and have them arrested for fraud." My father tried to protest. He puffed out his chest and started to say something about family rights, but Edwards didn't let him finish. He grabbed my father by the lapels of his mud-stained tuxedo and marched him backward. My mother let out a shrill shriek as another guard took her firmly by the arm, steering her toward the exit like a misbehaving child. Ebony didn't fight. She looked at Connor one last time, her eyes pleading for a reprieve. But he had turned his back to her, staring out the window at the manicured gardens. She slumped, letting the 3rd guard drag her out, her silicone stomach shifting awkwardly under her sweater. For a moment, it was just chaos. The sound of my mother's wailing and my father's empty threats echoed down the marble hallway until the heavy front door slammed shut, cutting off the noise. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavy, but clean. I was the only Jenkins left standing. Patricia turned to me. Her eyes were still cold, but the hostility was gone. She looked at the black folders I had left on the table, then up at my face. She didn't thank me. Women like Patricia don't thank people for doing what is necessary. But she gave me a curt nod, a microscopic acknowledgement of respect. She recognized that while we shared the same blood, I was not one of them. I didn't wait for her to dismiss me. I wasn't a trespasser. I was the whistleblower. I reached down and picked up my Hermes Birkin bag from the chair. It wasn't a fake. It wasn't charged to a stolen card. It was paid for with money I earned cleaning up messes just like this one. I smoothed down my blazer and walked toward the exit. I didn't run. I didn't scurry. I walked, with the rhythmic, confident click of my heels echoing on the marble. When I stepped out onto the massive stone porch, the sun was shining. Down the driveway, I saw my family's car being escorted off the premises by the security SUV. They were shouting at each other inside the vehicle, hands waving, blaming one another for the collapse of their house of cards. I walked past the drama, straight to my Porsche. I unlocked the door, slid into the leather seat, and put on my sunglasses. I didn't look back at the mansion. I didn't look back at the family that had tried to consume me. I shifted into gear and drove toward the gate. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just driving away. I was moving on. It has been exactly 30 days since the brunch at the Oldfield estate ended in a security escort. Usually, time heals all wounds, but in the case of my family, time just gave the lawyers enough room to sharpen their knives. I sat in the reception area of Sterling and Associates, the most aggressive family law firm in the city. I wasn't there as a defendant. I was there because I had been subpoenaed as a witness for the plaintiff. Connor was not looking for a divorce. A divorce implies that a valid marriage existed in the first place. Connor was filing for an annulment based on fraud in the inducement. He was erasing Ebony from his life as if she were a clerical error. When the heavy glass doors opened, I was ushered into a conference room that smelled of leather and intimidation. The table was long and polished, a stark contrast to the plastic table in the service tent where I had sat a month ago. On one side sat Connor. He looked different. The soft, golden retriever energy was gone. He looked tired, thinner, and his eyes were hard. Next to him was his lawyer, a shark of a man named Mr. Sterling. On the other side of the table sat my family. They looked like refugees from their own lives. My father, Marcus, was wearing a suit that was clearly 2 sizes too big now that the stress had eaten away his weight. My mother, Denise, wasn't wearing her usual layers of jewelry. She was staring at her hands, which were devoid of rings. And then there was Ebony. She was sitting in the middle, looking small and cornered. She wasn't wearing designer cashmere today. She was wearing a tracksuit, and her roots were showing. The facade had fully eroded. Mr. Sterling didn't waste time with pleasantries. He opened a binder that was 3 inches thick. He stated clearly that his client was seeking a full annulment on the grounds that the marriage was entered into under false pretenses. He listed the counts methodically: the falsified pregnancy, the misrepresented financial status, the concealed criminal record, and finally, the matter of the expenses. Connor wasn't just walking away. He was suing for damages. He wanted reimbursement for the venue, the catering, the flowers, and the honeymoon deposits. The total came to $140,000. My father let out a dry, hacking cough. He tried to speak, his voice trembling. He said they didn't have that kind of money. He said they were living in a 2-bedroom rental apartment now because the bank had taken the house. He pleaded for mercy, saying they were destitute. Mr. Sterling didn't blink. He said that was unfortunate, but not his client's problem. He said he would be filing for wage garnishment and seizing any remaining assets. Then, he turned his attention to the specific item that was the centerpiece of today's meeting: the engagement ring. It was a 5-carat emerald-cut diamond that Connor had bought with his own inheritance. It was valued at $50,000. By law, an engagement ring is a conditional gift. The condition is the marriage. Since the marriage was based on fraud, the condition was void. Connor wanted the ring back. Ebony shifted in her seat. She refused to make eye contact with Connor. She mumbled that she didn't have it. She said she lost it in the chaos of being kicked out of the estate. She said it must have fallen off her finger when the security guards grabbed her. It was a lie. I knew it was a lie. Connor knew it was a lie. Mr. Sterling didn't argue. He simply reached into his folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the polished table until it rested in front of Ebony. It was a photocopy of a pawn shop receipt from a place on 47th Street. The date on the receipt was the morning after the brunch. The amount listed was $8,000. She had sold a $50,000 heirlooms for pennies on the dollar just to get quick cash. The silence in the room was absolute. Connor looked at the receipt, then at Ebony. He didn't yell. He just looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. He asked her if that was what their relationship was worth to her. $8,000. Ebony started to cry, but it wasn't the manipulative crying from before. It was the ugly, raw sobbing of someone who realizes they have played their final card and lost. Mr. Sterling stated that since the ring had been liquidated, the $50,000 would be added to the judgment against her. He told them that this debt would follow them. It was non-dischargeable in bankruptcy because it was incurred through fraud. He told them that for the next 20 years, every time they earned $1, Connor would take 30 cents of it. I watched my parents. They weren't looking at Ebony with concern. They were looking at her with hatred. They realized that their retirement plan, their social standing, and their future were gone. They were tied to a sinking ship that they had helped build. As the meeting adjourned, Connor stood up. He walked past Ebony without a word. He stopped in front of me. He didn't smile, but he extended his hand. He thanked me for the truth. He said it was the most painful gift he had ever received, but it saved his life. I shook his hand. I watched my family gather their papers and shuffle out of the room, arguing in hushed whispers about whose fault it was. I realized then that I didn't hate them anymore. You can't hate something that is already broken. I walked out of the office and into the sunlight. The air felt cleaner. The war was over. I had won. Not by fighting, but by simply turning on the lights. The sheriff's deputies arrived at the house on Oak Creek Drive at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. It was poetic timing. Tuesday was the day my parents had told the Oldfields that the $2 million trust fund would mature. Instead, the only thing that matured was the foreclosure notice. My parents didn't leave with dignity. They didn't hire movers because they couldn't afford them, and they didn't have friends because they had alienated everyone with their pretension. They were forced to pack 30 years of accumulated lies into black garbage bags, while the neighbors they had spent decades trying to impress watched from behind twitching curtains. The destination was not another estate. With an eviction on their record, a credit score in the basement, and a fraud judgment hanging over their heads, no reputable landlord would touch them. Their only option was the Creekside Arms. The name sounds pleasant, like a retirement community with a duck pond. In reality, it is a crumbling, subsidized housing complex on the far south side of the city, sitting next to a water treatment plant. I wasn't there to see it, but I know the place well. It's the kind of place where the elevators are permanently out of service and the hallways smell of boiled cabbage and stale cigarettes. My father, Marcus, a man who believed he was too good to pump his own gas, had to haul their boxes up 4 flights of stairs. He was wheezing, sweating, and cursing my name with every step. The apartment was a 1-bedroom unit. It was smaller than the master closet in their old house. The linoleum was peeling in the corners, and the windows looked out onto a brick wall covered in graffiti. My mother, Denise, sat down on the edge of a stained mattress that had been left behind by the previous tenant. She looked around the room, waiting for the nightmare to end, waiting for someone to yell "cut" so she could go back to her real life. But there were no cameras. This was the new reality. For the first time in their lives, the silence was terrifying. There was no hum of the wine fridge, no sound of the gardener blowing leaves, just the sound of a siren wailing in the distance and the drip, drip, drip of a leaking faucet that the landlord had no intention of fixing. Naturally, their first instinct was not introspection. It was blame. My father paced the small room, kicking at the garbage bags. He ranted about how I was an ungrateful traitor. He convinced himself that I had orchestrated this entire downfall just to spite him. He looked at my mother and gave the order he had given 1,000 times before. He told her to call me. He told her to turn on the waterworks. He wanted her to call me and say that he was having chest pains. He wanted her to say they were starving. He was convinced that if they applied enough pressure, I would crack. I always had before. I was the responsible one, the fixer. He figured I was sitting in my penthouse, drowning in guilt, just waiting for the opportunity to write a check and save them from the consequences of their own actions. Denise wiped her eyes, put on her best victim voice, and dialed my number. She put it on speakerphone so Marcus could hear me apologize. But she didn't hear a ringtone. She didn't hear my voice. "The number you have reached is not accepting calls from this number," the automated operator said, her voice cool and indifferent. "Please check the number and try again." Denise frowned, confused. She ended the call and dialed again. The same robotic rejection followed. She tried texting. The message bubble turned green, hung in the ether for a second, and then failed to deliver. She looked up at Marcus, the blood draining from her face. She whispered that the call wasn't going through. Marcus snatched the phone from her hand, his face turning a deep shade of purple. He dialed from his own phone. Same result. He tried calling from Ebony's phone, which was currently sitting on a cardboard box because she was curled up in the corner, catatonic with shock. Same result. They realized then that it wasn't a glitch. I hadn't just ignored them. I had erased them. I had changed my number. I had blocked their emails. I had instructed the security at my building to turn them away on sight. The bridge wasn't just burned. I had demolished the foundations. My father threw the phone across the room. It hit the thin drywall, leaving a dent. He screamed until his voice gave out, cursing the daughter who had finally learned to say no. But his screams didn't matter anymore. They were just noise in a noisy apartment complex. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, with no one left to manipulate, no one left to steal from, and no audience left to watch their performance. The ATM was closed. The fixer had retired. And as the sun went down over the industrial park outside their window, the darkness in that room was absolute. The fluorescent lights of the Waffle House on I-95 do not flatter anyone, especially at 3 a.m. For Ebony Jenkins, who used to spend 3 hours contouring her face before leaving the house, the harsh white glare was a nightly torture. She was no longer wearing cashmere or silk. She was wearing a polyester uniform that was 2 sizes too big, stained with grease and smelling of stale maple syrup. Her name tag, which hung crookedly on her chest, didn't say fashion stylist or hedge fund manager. It just said Ebony, and underneath in smaller letters, it said trainee. She wiped down the sticky counter with a gray rag, her movements sluggish and resentful. Her feet, shoved into ugly black non-slip shoes, throbbed with a dull, aching pain. She wasn't used to standing for 8 hours. She was used to sitting in brunch spots and getting pedicures. Now her expensive acrylic nails were gone, replaced by short, chipped nubbins because the health code didn't allow fake nails around the food. Every time she scrubbed a dried piece of egg off a table, she felt a little piece of her soul die. The bell above the door chimed, signaling a new group of customers. Ebony didn't look up immediately. She just sighed, grabbed the sticky menus, and walked over to the booth by the window. It was a group of 4 girls, probably college students, dressed in club clothes. They were loud, laughing and scrolling through their phones, smelling of cheap perfume and vodka. Ebony hated them instantly. They were everything she used to be. She slapped the menus down on the table. "Welcome to Waffle House," she muttered, not bothering to fake a smile. "What can I get you?" One of the girls looked up, annoyed by the lack of service. She opened her mouth to make a snarky comment, But then she froze. She squinted at Ebony, tilting her head to the side. Her eyes widened. She nudged her friend next to her and whispered something. The friend looked up. Then the third girl looked. Suddenly, the table went quiet. The air shifted from drunken hunger to malicious excitement. "Oh my God," the girl in the pink top said, her voice rising an octave. "Wait, I know you. You are the girl from TikTok. You are the silicone bride." Ebony felt the blood drain from her face. She turned to walk away, but her legs felt like lead. The story of the wedding hadn't just stayed in Barrington. One of the guests, probably a cousin she had ignored for years, had leaked the video of the confrontation. The clip of Connor exposing her fake stomach had 50 million views. The hashtag #ScammyEbony was trending for 3 days straight. She wasn't just broke. She was the internet's favorite punchline. The girls pulled out their phones. The flashlights turned on, blinding her. "It is her!" the friend screamed, laughing. "Hey, where's the baby? Did you leave it in the recycling bin?" Ebony held up her tray to block her face, backing away toward the kitchen. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Please don't record me. I am just trying to work." "Work?" the girl in the pink top scoffed. "I thought you were a hedge fund manager. Did the market crash, or did your fake pregnancy test bounce?" They were filming her, narrating to their followers that they had found the famous scammer serving hash browns on the interstate. The humiliation was physical. It felt like her skin was burning. The cook, a large man named Daryl who had no patience for drama, rang the service bell aggressively. "Order up, Ebony! Stop playing with the customers and get these plates!" She had to go back. She had to serve them. She picked up the heavy plates of waffles and eggs, her hands shaking so bad the silverware rattled. As she set the food down, the girls were still filming, zooming in on her name tag, zooming in on her ruined hands. One of them asked if she could pay for her meal with a fake credit card, or if that was only for family members. They laughed. It was a cruel, hyena-like sound that echoed off the tile walls. Ebony retreated to the dish pit in the back, leaning against the metal sink, trying to catch her breath. She wanted to quit. She wanted to walk out the back door and never come back. But she couldn't. Every Tuesday, her paycheck was deposited, and every Wednesday, 30% of it was automatically garnished and sent to the law offices of Sterling and Associates. Connor was taking his money back, one minimum wage hour at a time. The judge had been very clear. If she missed a payment, she would be in contempt of court. She pulled her pay stub out of her apron pocket. It was crumpled and stained with coffee. She looked at the numbers. After taxes, after the garnishment, and after the uniform fee, she had made $200 for a week of hell. It wasn't enough to buy a bottle of the perfume she used to wear. It was barely enough to pay for the shared room she was renting in a basement apartment. She looked at her reflection in the stainless steel of the refrigerator door. The woman staring back looked 10 years older. Her eyes were hollow. Her mouth was drawn in a permanent line of bitterness. There was no glamour left. There was no potential. There was just the smell of grease and the crushing weight of consequences. Daryl yelled her name again. "Table 4 needs coffee!" Ebony shoved the pay stub back into her pocket. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, took a deep breath of the stale, greasy air, and walked back out onto the floor. She picked up the coffee pot. The girls at table 4 were still watching her, whispering and giggling. Ebony poured the coffee. She didn't spill a drop. She didn't scream. She just served them, because for the first time in her life, she had no other choice. This was her sentence, served one waffle at a time under the unforgiving lights of a 24-hour diner. The dust didn't just settle after the explosion at the Oldfield estate. It cleared completely, leaving my world sharper and brighter than it had ever been. I expected a period of social isolation. I assumed that by nuking a high society wedding, I would be blacklisted from the elite circles that my design firm relied on. I thought I had committed social suicide. But I had miscalculated the nature of the ultra-wealthy. They don't hate scandal. They hate weakness. And what I had shown them was absolute, unshakable strength. 3 weeks after the incident, my office phone rang. It was the personal assistant to Eleanor Vanderwoodson, a name that carries as much weight in the city as the mayor's. She wasn't calling to gossip. She was calling to offer me the contract for the renovation of her historic brownstone in the Gold Coast district. It was a project I had been chasing for 2 years, a career-defining job that would put my firm on the national map. When I met Eleanor for the final walkthrough, I couldn't help but ask her why she chose me now, after ignoring my proposals for so long. Eleanor smiled, sipping her sparkling water. She told me that she had brunch with Patricia Oldfield last week. She said, Patricia described me as the only person in that entire room who wasn't for sale. She told me that in a world full of yes men and sycophants, a woman who is willing to burn down her own inheritance to stand up for the truth is the only kind of person she wants handling her millions. It turned out that my integrity was a better marketing strategy than any portfolio I could have printed. The contract was signed the next day. The deposit alone was more than my parents' old mortgage. With my career skyrocketing, I turned my attention to the loose end that had started this entire war, the $100,000. The check I had written to bail out my father was still sitting in my desk drawer. I had voided it the night of the wedding, drawing a thick black line through the numbers. But the capital was still there in my account, sitting stagnant. I decided it was time to put that money to work, not to save a drowning man, but to build a ship of my own. I didn't buy a luxury car. I didn't buy designer clothes to flaunt my victory. I did what Marcus Jenkins should have done 30 years ago. I studied the market. I found a rundown studio apartment in a neighborhood that was on the verge of gentrification. It was ugly. The carpet was shag orange, the cabinets were peeling laminate, and it smelled like old library books. But the bones were good, and the price was right. I bought it in cash. There were no balloons payments. There were no predatory loans. There was just a clean title and a set of keys that belonged to me and me alone. I spent my weekends there, not as a glamorous CEO, but as a worker. I tore up the carpet myself. I painted the walls a crisp gallery white. I installed a modern kitchenette using leftover materials from my commercial projects. I poured my sweat equity into those 400 square feet. When I was finished, I didn't move in. I listed it for rent. Within 48 hours, I had a signed lease from a young medical resident. The rent check I received the first month wasn't huge, but it was the most beautiful piece of paper I had ever held. It represented passive income. It was wealth that generated itself, built on a foundation of hard work and smart decisions, not lies and leverage. I remember standing in that empty studio right before the tenant moved in. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the clean windows, hitting the refinished hardwood floors. I thought about my parents in their dark, cramping apartment next to the water treatment plant. I thought about Ebony scrubbing grease off tables at the Waffle House. They had spent their lives chasing the appearance of wealth, and they had ended up with nothing. I had risked everything to destroy that appearance, and I had ended up with everything. I walked to the door and locked it, feeling the solid, heavy click of the deadbolt. It was a sound of security. I walked down the stairs and out onto the street, breathing in the cool autumn air. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an email from my accountant confirming that the closing on the studio was finalized and the Vanderwoodson wire transfer had hit. I smiled, put my phone away, and hailed a cab. I wasn't just Nia the scapegoat anymore. I was Nia, the architect of my own life, and the view from here was magnificent. It was a Friday night at Le Jardin, the kind of establishment where the menu has no prices and the waiting list is 3 months long. I was seated at a corner table, the candlelight reflecting off the crystal stemware. Across from me sat Julian, a corporate litigator I had met during the Vanderwoodson contract negotiations. He was charming, sharp, and refreshingly authentic. We were celebrating the approval of my latest architectural blueprints, laughing about the absurd zoning laws of the city. For a moment, amidst the soft jazz and the scent of truffle oil, I completely forgot that I had ever come from a family of chaos. The illusion of my separate peace was broken by the arrival of the busser. A figure appeared at our elbow to clear the appetizer plates, moving with a heavy, resentful lethargy that seemed out of place in such a polished environment. I didn't look up at first, engrossed in Julian's story about a case he had just won. But then I saw the hands reaching for the china. They were red, chapped, and trembling. I recognized the shape of the fingers. My heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but out of sheer disbelief. I looked up. It was Ebony. But it wasn't the sister I remembered. The girl who wouldn't be caught dead without a full face of contour and lash extensions looked like a ghost. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, frizzy bun, held in place by a hairnet. Her skin was dull and gray, stripped of the expensive facials she used to steal money to afford. She was wearing an ill-fitting black vest over a white shirt that had a stain on the collar. She looked exhausted. She looked broken. She froze when she saw me. Her hand hovered over my plate, the silverware rattling against the porcelain. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a second, I saw the old spark of entitlement flare up. She looked from my tailored silk dress to Julian's expensive suit, and the shame in her eyes instantly curdled into venom. She forgot where she was. She forgot the uniform. "So this is where you are," she hissed, her voice loud enough to cause the couple at the next table to turn their heads. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? Sitting there like a queen while I clean up your crumbs? You think you're better than me?" Julian stopped talking, his smile fading into a frown of confusion. He started to stand up, his protective instinct kicking in. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice firm. "Is there a problem here?" Ebony opened her mouth to scream, to make a scene, to spill the vitriol that had been poisoning her for weeks. She wanted to ruin my night, just like I had ruined her fantasy. But before she could get a word out, a shadow fell over the table. The floor manager, a stern man with a headset and zero tolerance for incompetence, materialized behind her. He didn't ask questions. He didn't care about family drama. He saw a low-level employee harassing a VIP client. "Jenkins!" he barked, his voice like a whip crack. "What do you think you are doing? We are not paying you to socialize and disturb the guests." Ebony flinched as if she had been struck. She spun around, her face pale. I know her, sir. She's my—" "I don't care if she is the Pope," the manager cut her off, his eyes cold and unforgiving. You have tables to clear in Section 4. Do your job or get out. If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back for your check." The threat hung in the air. I watched the calculation happen in Ebony's eyes. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the plate. But she remembered the garnishment. She remembered the rent. She remembered that she had absolutely nowhere else to go. The defiance drained out of her body, leaving her slumped and pathetic. She lowered her head, her chin touching her chest. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered. "It won't happen again." She turned back to the table. She didn't look at me. She couldn't. She hurriedly stacked the dirty plates, her movements frantic and servile. She wiped the tablecloth with a gray rag, bowing her head in total humiliation. I watched my sister, the girl who used to dream of being a Kardashian, retreat into the kitchen, pushing through the swinging doors with a tray of garbage. Julian looked at me, his eyes full of questions. "Do you know her?" he asked softly. I took a sip of my wine. The taste was crisp and clean. I looked at the kitchen door one last time, then turned back to the man who saw me for who I really was. "I used to," I said, my voice steady. "But that person doesn't work here anymore." Julian didn't press for details. He was a lawyer. He knew that "used to" was a complete sentence. He simply poured more wine into my glass and steered the conversation back to the architecture of the Art Deco building across the street. As I listened to him speak, watching the way the candlelight played on his face, a strange realization washed over me. I found myself checking my own pulse, waiting for the surge of adrenaline. I waited for the dark, twisted satisfaction of seeing my abuser brought low. I expected to feel a triumphant sense of victory echoing in my chest, seeing Ebony reduced to a frightened servant. But the feeling never came. There was no gloating. There was no manic joy in her suffering. Instead, I felt something far more profound and unfamiliar. I felt light. For 29 years, I had carried the Jenkins family name like a backpack filled with lead. I had been their safety net, their bank, their crisis manager, and their emotional punching bag. Every time they stumbled, I was expected to bleed to cushion their fall. I had conditioned myself to believe that their failures were my emergencies, that their happiness was my responsibility. Seeing Ebony in that uniform, terrified of a shift manager, broke the final link in that chain. I realized that the tragedy was entirely of their own making. I wasn't the villain for cutting the rope. I was just the survivor who finally refused to be pulled off the cliff with them. I realized that the concept of family obligation I had been raised with was toxic. Family is not a suicide pact. It is not a license to abuse, steal, and destroy without consequence. It is not a blank check that you get to cash just because we share DNA. I looked down at my hands resting on the crisp white tablecloth. They weren't shaking. My stomach wasn't in knots, wondering if my credit card would be declined because my sister had stolen the numbers again. The constant, low-level hum of anxiety that had been the soundtrack of my life was gone. It was replaced by a quiet, steady silence. I looked at the candle flickering on the table. The flame was steady, protected by the glass hurricane. That was me. I had built my walls, not to keep people out, but to keep the wind from blowing me out. I took a bite of my dinner. It was simple, perfectly cooked, and honest. It tasted like freedom. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop anymore. I wasn't checking my phone for emergency texts or threats of suicide. The silence from my family was no longer a punishment they were inflicting on me to teach me a lesson. It was the reward I had given myself. I smiled at Julian, really smiled, and for the first time in my life, I was fully present in the moment, unburdened by the ghosts of the past. I am sitting back in my living room, the city lights of Chicago twinkling below me like a sea of diamonds. I still have the yellow badge. It is sitting on my mantelpiece framed in glass. For a long time, looking at that piece of cheap plastic made me feel shame. It made me feel rejected, like I was the disposal bin for my family's failures. But now, when I look at it, I see something completely different. I see a ticket to freedom. If I had given them that check, nothing would have changed. The warehouse would still be gone, Ebony would still be living a lie, and I would be $100,000 poorer and infinitely more miserable. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted a lifeline. And by cutting that line, I forced them to finally face the reality they had been running from for decades. They are struggling now, yes. But for the first time in their lives, they are living an honest existence, even if it is a painful one. People tell you that family is everything. They tell you that blood is thicker than water, but they forget that blood can also carry disease. Sometimes, you have to quarantine yourself to survive. Being downgraded to a restricted guest was not a punishment. It was a liberation. It restricted me from their toxicity. It restricted me from their debts. It restricted me from their lies. It put a velvet rope between my peace and their chaos. I reached out and picked up my glass of vintage Cabernet. The liquid swirled, dark and rich against the light. I looked directly into the camera lens, breaking the fourth wall for the final time. I realized that for 29 years, I was fighting to get into the VIP section of a club that was burning to the ground. I didn't need their approval to be valuable. I didn't need their permission to be happy. The only name on the guest list that matters is mine. I am the architect. I am the investor. And most importantly, I am the gatekeeper of my own life. To the yellow badge, and to the realization that sometimes being uninvited is the greatest invitation of all. I raised the glass in a silent toast to the woman I have become. I took a slow sip, savoring the taste of a life that is finally, wholly mine. The screen fades to black. The most profound lesson from Nia's journey is that no is a complete sentence. We often confuse enablement with love, believing that supporting family means shielding them from the consequences of their own actions. However, true self-respect begins when we establish boundaries against those who exploit us, regardless of shared DNA. Nia proved that being excluded from a toxic table isn't a rejection. It is a powerful form of protection. Your peace, financial security, and mental health are assets far too valuable to be sacrificed for the sake of appearances. Sometimes, you must be the villain in their story to finally become the hero in your own. Have you ever had to set a hard boundary with a family member to save your own peace? Tell us your story in the comments below.